And because you're developing differently, you then will have delayed language, delayed social skills, and you'll develop some of these stereotypical behaviors. Stereotypical behaviors can also be considered compulsive behaviors. These are the kids who will get really upset if they line up their toys, and if you disrupt the line, they'll freak out. Or they want you to drive a certain direction, and if you drive a different direction, they'll be very upset. Now, these are compulsions. The only other disorder in medicine, psychology, and so on that resembles that is obsessive-compulsive disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is when you have these compulsions. You have to go check on things, or you have to go wash your hands 100 times, or whatever it is. It's a compulsion. Do you know what the classification of obsessive-compulsive disorder, do you know what chapter it's in? Anxiety disorders. OCD is a form of anxiety disorder. And autism, I propose, is related to a certain level of anxiety, and I think that's why some of the kids do engage in these self-stimulatory types of behaviors, because it gives them a sense of control. And it regulates them, down-regulates them. So they shouldn't actually be called self-stimulatory. I think they should be called more like self-relaxing or self-regulating. So given this model, which I hope makes sense to you, what do? These are the treatments. We minimize exposure to toxins. That's where all the dietary interventions come in, right? And we're trying to minimize exposure to any kind of toxin. That's why we talk about splitting up vaccines, not giving vaccines when the kids are sick, trying to not give antibiotics unless we're sure that the child has a bacterial infection, all of those types of things. We treat the underlying medical disorder, because unless my child is sleeping, unless my child is eating properly and able to digest the food that he's eating, he's going to be low on nutrients. This is an interesting thing. Every study that does anything with medical shows, by the way, the kids are low on a number of supplements, nutrients. They're just low on various vitamins and so on. So that should be one of our primary treatments, is let me get my child back up on, oh wow, his vitamin B levels are low, his vitamin D levels are low. Let me just get him back on normal track with giving supplementation. Identify the sensory issues, and we'll talk a little bit about that, because that's huge. Because if you are a child who is not able to receive information visually, then I need to work on your auditory reception to receive info. If you can't receive information auditorily, then I need to present everything visually to you. The sensory modality identifies how you give information to this child. How are you communicating? Otherwise, what you're doing is you're trying to use language with a child who potentially can't even hear you because they're so focused on background noise. Okay? And then you use various techniques like behavioral intervention to teach new learning patterns. So that's the overall program, and doing all of those things at the right time is what helps you to reduce or eliminate the symptoms. Make sense? Okay. Are you warm enough now? Everybody's good? Because I heard people were cold before or something. Can't imagine why. So let's talk about minimize exposure to toxins real briefly. So some of the things that you can do, make sure your physician only uses antibiotics when necessary. Avoid pesticides. Go organic doesn't mean much, but make sure, like farmed products generally have the lowest pesticides. Spread out vaccinations to reduce stress on the immune system. Check for metal toxicity to determine the need. If your child is actually already highly toxic, then you might want to consider various forms of chelation. Treat the underlying medical illness. So we're talking about tests, and I heard David talking about this earlier as well. test for things like immune markers that'll show you if your child's Ig levels are completely off, which means your child is reacting to some external toxin and is in fight mode. Their immune system is trying to fight something. So you have to figure out what that is. We sometimes talk about these things as allergies. They're not just allergies. These are reactions to any kind of toxin. Could even just be a bacterial infection. Could be exposure to something like strep. So it could be a number of different things. This is a blood test. And you can do this. Now, I don't know if you have physicians out here who are trained in these techniques, but I suppose the best way to find out is to go on a website called Autism Research Institute, and on there there's a whole ton of a list of doctors who are trained for just autism interventions. And you really kind of have to be cautious in this field, like everything else. You know, I don't want to, it's just, anything that grows from 1 in 15,000 to 1 in 110 in a period of 20 years is perceived as a market. So a lot of people will jump into this field not really having the know-how. So you want to make sure that you interview these physicians. It's kind of like when you're having a baby and you have to interview your pediatrician. Interview the person that you're going to work with and make sure they have a general understanding of what autism is in your child and they have ideas on how to treat it. Don't find physicians who are just going to give you what you want or just tell you, okay, here's a medication that's going to numb the symptoms. This single medication that's been approved for autism is Risperdal or risperidone, and all that does is basically numb your symptoms. So the child is not self-stimulating. The child is not having tantrums. Well, I actually want my child to have tantrums because he's trying to communicate something. I need to figure that out. So those are the things that are kind of important. And it is important to find physicians who are knowledgeable in this area because mainstream still doesn't quite understand autism. Here's something very important, I guess. I still hear from people that when they go to their physicians, the physician will say something like, oh, well, he has, of course he has no sleep. That's part of autism. And that's not true at all. It is not part of autism to not sleep. And the physician needs to pay attention to all the comorbid medical issues that the child is having and not assume. This is called overgeneralization of diagnosis. And not just say, oh, all kids with autism are like this. Okay? A lot of children with autism do not get the medical treatments they need because they have that label called autism. And everybody assumes, oh, well, it's part of the autism for the child to have GI problems. It's not. You need to treat the medical issues separately. And then you need to look at things like oxidative stress markers. These are tests that the labs can perform for you. And again, you have to work with a physician who knows how to order these tests. And then you have to also look at if your child does have specific gastrointestinal problems, treat those. This is hugely important. If I have a child who is not receiving nutrition, their brain is not going to start overcompensating and working properly. I need my child to receive nutrition. If you have inflammation, it doesn't matter how many supplements you take, they're going nowhere because there's too much inflammation. So you do need to work. This is why the majority of the physicians work first on trying to reduce inflammation in the gut. Just because everything else we're going to give that child is not going to have any effect unless that inflammation has reduced. Okay? And this could be anti-inflammatories, steroid medications, antifungals, anti-clostridia. You would have to test and see. Some of my kids have fungal issues continuously. We put them on an antifungal. They get so much better. You see it in their behavior. I have data. I've published on this where I give fungus to a child, antifungal to a child who has nail fungus, and their entire behavior changes. So there's fungal issues with a lot of the kids. There's different types of clostridial issues with some of the kids. These are the things that the physician has to identify. Why? Because your number one goal is stabilize medically. Make the child feel better medically. Because unless you do that, they're not sleeping, they're not able to learn, they're not able to do anything after that. So once you get them stable, then we can talk about learning. So let's talk about that. Let's say we've taken our child and now gotten the child to the point where they're getting better. You have the child on a dietary intervention, perhaps. The GI tract is working fine. Child is sleeping better. How many people here have kids with sleep issues?